HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Mrs. Harris Goes to Moscow by Paul Gallico, read by Juliet Stevenson.
Chapter 1. The photograph definitely had never been there before. Of this Mrs. Harris was certain, being sharp-eyed, observant, and most particular about the little objects, knick-knacks, pictures, and mementos which cluttered the London flats of the clients for whom she did daily work, since the majority of them were fussy about their placements and irritable when they were moved. Some 8 by 10 inches, framed to stand up, it now reposed on Mr. Lockwood's desk. Against a most curious background of snow, a great wall topped by a strange tower, it revealed, fur-clad, the head and shoulders of a lovely-looking girl. Mrs. Harris, whose purpose had been to dust Mr. Lockwood's desk, his typewriter, reference books, and the various toys that all writers seem to keep in and about their working area, picked up the mystery photo and examined it more closely. It was obvious that it was a blow-up from a snapshot, but even this enlargement of the picture's grain did not conceal the luminous melancholy of the eyes. The girl wore a fur hat, her hair dark beneath it. Those eyes looking straight into the camera, or the person behind the camera, were trying to convey a message, and to Mrs. Harris, who was both imaginative and incurably romantic, the communication was one of all-pervading sadness and longing. Winter, snow, an unhappy girl, and behind her some kind of grim fortress. This sadness transferred itself to Mrs. Harris, or rather, for the first time, crystallized and intensified the emotion she realized was in some measure always present around Mr. Lockwood's small, rented, furnished apartment. For from the beginning, 6 months ago, when she had taken on to do for him a couple of hours a day as one of her regular clients, she had felt him to be a distracted man with some kind of secret sorrow. She stood there, a thin, wiry figure, armed cap-à-pied for the battle against dust and dirt, in overalls, slippers, and headcloth, the long handle of the floor polishing mop held upright in the crook of her arm, the picture in one hand, a dust rag in the other. She had little darting mischievous eyes which were now aglow with the excitement of her discovery, rounded cheeks like frosted crab-apples, and her chirpy sparrow's face was a campaign map of lines and furrows of a lifetime of struggle. Thus engrossed, she did not hear Mr. Geoffrey Lockwood let himself into the flat and march through the living-room into his study to catch her at what she would have called snooping at the picture. Ada Harris was not basically a snooper, and, nipped in flagrante, she began to rub the glass vigorously with her duster. Mr. Lockwood, with a curiously stern look upon his otherwise pleasant and rather handsome countenance, came over and, without a word, took the photograph from Mrs. Harris's hands and replaced it, leaving Mrs. Harris standing there with a large portion of egg on her face. The awful silence absolutely shrieked to be broken. Mrs. Harris said, "Ain't she beautiful?" Mr. Lockwood did not reply, and because his back was partially turned to her, she could not see the expression on his face, which was dark and lowering and did not suit him at all. He was youngish, no more than 35, sandy-haired, blue-eyed, with a rugged maleness of features, and a mouth of which his short moustache did not entirely conceal the slight weakness. His face in repose always had an air of ingenuous bewilderment and absent-mindedness that from the very first had awakened Mrs. Harris's mother instincts, which were never too far from the surface, since she herself had a married daughter and grandchildren. Mrs. Harris, her remark left unanswered, felt that yet another was called for, and asked, "Where is it? What's that place there? It looks like a jail." Mr. Lockwood replied briefly, "The Kremlin," and then suddenly, without warning, slammed down the package of typing paper he had been out to purchase on the desk and shouted, "Oh, God damn them!" with such ferocity and vehemence that Mrs. Harris jumped and let out a little scream, and then apologised. "I'm sorry, sir, I wasn't meaning—" Mr. Lockwood turned to her and said, "Oh, not you, Mrs. Harris," and was looking at the photo and through the girl at the wall behind her, repeating, "them," and then added, "and the bloody don't-give-a-damn Foreign Office as well." Mr. Lockwood then said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harris, I didn't mean to startle you." "Nor did I mean to snoop, neither," said Mrs. Harris. "It's just that I hadn't never seen it before, and when I come in today, there it was, and her looking so lovely I couldn't help but—" "I know," Mr. Lockwood admitted. "I couldn't bear to have it out before, but when I thought the Foreign Office was finally going to do something for me—" He didn't finish that sentence, but added another equally baffling to Mrs. Harris. "She's a Russian girl." Baffling was hardly the word to describe Mrs. Harris's emotions or her flaming curiosity, which required every bit of her self-control to be contained. Foreign Office? Kremlin? She'd heard of this, but Russian girl? Who was she? Wife? Sweetheart? Mistress? Where was she? And why? Unquestionably, she was the key to that mystery and melancholy that always had been wrapped around Mr. Lockwood ever since she had answered his ad and come to work for him between the hours of 9 and 11 in the morning. But it was a key which Mrs. Harris's innate sense of propriety refused to let her turn. Ada Harris belonged to that slowly vanishing breed of London char who, for 5 bob in the old days, now 50 pence an hour, visited small London flats or offices and cleaned them. She herself specialised in dwellings because she loved and was fascinated by other people's lives, and that was where one encountered them. Her clients eventually found her to be not only a conscientious drudge, but a woman primed with a fabulous fund of wisdom, home truths, information and sound common sense, garnered through practically a lifelong attendance at the School of Hard Knocks. She could give advice to the lovelorn, had a list of all the best hairdressers, shops and bargain counters at her fingertips, understood the 2-legged male animal, could counsel on marital problems, was up to date on all the latest press reports of marriage, divorce and scandal, and was herself a member of the Charlady's Underground, which passed back and forth titbits of succulent gossip acquired at first hand, and which did not find their way into the newspapers. She was, however, as she had said, not a snooper, nor did she ever query or pry into the personal affairs of her clients. But once such a one had ever unburdened herself, it was usually the mistress of the establishment who did so, or asked for a bit of advice. Ada was ready to hold forth. Propped up by her mop handle, she could let them have anything from a half-hour to 45 minutes without drawing a deep breath. She loved nothing better than a good heart-to-heart chat, oft to the considerable distress of employers who had rendezvous with beauty parlours, milliners, dressmakers, or had a taxi ticking over outside. A client would have to volunteer. Mrs. Harris would never ask a direct question. To his own eternal surprise, Mr. Lockwood suddenly found himself volunteering. He had sat himself down at his desk, and after a moment of regarding his electric portable morosely, he said, "She's an Intourist guide in Moscow. We met while I was last there for this book, Russia Revealed." Ada Harris could hardly credit her ears. A man she had always felt to be at the core of some mystery, impervious to her ministrations and attempts at mothering, appeared to be about to come clean. And Lockwood, without having realised it, seemed to have the need to do so triggered by the production for the first time of the photograph he had long concealed amongst his effects, when it looked as though there might be help forthcoming to his problem. The final flat refusal of the Foreign Office to make any representations dashed hopes which had been too high. Mrs. Harris's reaction and the whole miserable, unhappy affair crowding in on him, he was ready to unload. And to what better dead-end safety valve than this semi-anonymous drudge who appeared daily, including Saturday, for a date with broom, pail, scrubbing-brush and soap powder to clean up his bachelor's mess, and then vanish into limbo. "She is an Intourist guide," he repeated. "Her name is Lisabeta Nadyezhda Borovskaya, but I called her Liz." And then a phrase leapt into his head, and he let it out before realizing it. "I suppose we just sort of went up in flames." And as he looked at the tiny figure of his listener, mouth open, little eyes popping, hanging on his every word, he fell prey to sudden embarrassment, and then continued more calmly and said, "It wasn't really all like that. I mean, we wanted to get married. I've never known anyone like her before. Well, you've seen her picture." Embarrassment curbed him again, and he added lamely, "Forgive me, I'm talking like a schoolboy." But Mrs. Harris at this point was not going to have the tap turned off. Now that the opening had been made, she was privileged. She said, "What happened? Why didn't you?" Lockwood's chin was down on his chest, and his eyes looked away from what seemed to him to be no future and into the past. He replied in one word, "Russia," as though that were the answer to all questions. And then, seeing his audience still agog for information and aware that he had started something, said, "They're dead set against foreigners, and forbid any of their people leaving the country or marrying one. We were lucky to be able to keep it completely secret, and then I had to leave. If they'd ever found out, she would have been in—" He realized then that his incoherence and cryptic sentences were getting neither him nor his audience anywhere, and thereupon launched into a more consecutive narrative. They had met, fallen in love, and pledged themselves to one another at the very outset of Lockwood's tour of research in Russia. Moscow had been his first stop before journeying into the interior on a planned Intourist itinerary which, however, Lockwood intended to evade at several points to acquire the material he would need for the book his publishers had commissioned, Russia Revealed. They had been extraordinarily fortunate in that their love affair had not been uncovered during his 3 weeks in the Russian capital. Discreet inquiries, as though for a book, into the problems connected with a Russian marrying a foreigner exposed the enormity of the problem. Such a marriage might take place after unravelling reels of red tape and obstructionism, but even then there was no guarantee that the wife or the husband, whichever one was the Russian citizen, would be allowed to leave the country. The prospects were bleak, but the two had the courage and tenacity of people in love, and agreed that first Lockwood must complete his trip, which would take him as far east as Khabarovsk and the Chinese border on the Amur, and as far south as Tashkent and Samarkand, as well as Russia's Black Sea resorts. Upon his return, he would contact her again, and they would discreetly tackle both problems, getting married and arranging for her to be allowed to return to England with him. Lockwood had friends in the Foreign Office in London, as well as some contacts in the embassy in Moscow, and to the lovers the affair did not look utterly hopeless. The fact that there were potential dangers in the nature of Lockwood's book was an additional hazard with which he did not burden the girl. He had laid his plans well, and did not expect anything to go awry. They would not try to communicate during his absence. Lisabeta would continue guiding British tourists on their packaged trek through Moscow's sights. Upon his return, a mutual friend would introduce them, as though they were meeting for the first time. They would then risk letting the friendship develop openly and make the attempt to marry. Lockwood was to be back in Moscow in a matter of 3 months. While he told his tale in a depressed monotone of clipped sentences, practically in synopsis form, Mrs. Harris tried to follow with her alert mind and see, or rather picture, some of what he was telling, but she had no point of reference beyond the photograph with its background of grim wall and tower. Only in general was she aware that life behind the Iron Curtain was not all that it was cracked up to be. She had also lived long enough to know the truth behind the saying about best-laid plans, etc., and from Lockwood's demeanour it was obvious that his had gone plenty agley. The important thing was to keep him going and learn more, for at that point Lockwood had ceased to speak and was sitting miserably regarding the photograph. Mrs. Harris said,
"Oh, blimey! What happened? They wouldn't let you get married?"
Lockwood came out of his reverie and answered, "Worse than that. I never saw her again." This was what was killing him, he confessed, as he picked up the story again, which was one of overconfidence and betrayal. During the trip he had managed to interview a dissident writer, exiled from Moscow, having served a term in a Russian labour camp, and who, in addition, had been given the treatment in a lunatic asylum until protest from the West had secured his release. The meeting with this man had been discreet, but not sufficiently so, and when Lockwood had stepped off the train in Moscow, he had been immediately picked up by the Russian secret police. Had not another part of Lockwood's plans worked out, it would have gone hard with him. As it was, he had kept a duplicate set of notes on the journey. The ones that mattered, the dangerous ones, he had been successful in smuggling out through Turkey during his visit to Sochi on the Black Sea, and in the last minute something had made him include the photo of Lisabeta in the packet. So when the KGB pulled him into one of their underground salons and put him through 24 hours of grilling, he was clean. His notes were merely those of a travel writer interested in scenery, customs, costumes, and the picturesque. His visit to the dissident he had explained as only an expression of his admiration for the writer's work. There was nothing on which to hold Lockwood, and risk disturbing the fragile détente that was being put together, but his interview with the proscribed and dissident writer had made him persona non grata. The KGB confiscated his notes and every other scrap of paper found upon him, escorted him from the interrogation cell to the airport, and 5 hours later Lockwood found himself back in London. The full implications of Lockwood's dilemma had not yet struck Mrs. Harris, but faced with a problem that had been exposed to her by a client, her mind was already working and searching for a way out, and she was beginning to experience the thrill of participating vicariously in someone else's trouble. She said,
"But can't you get back somehow? A lot of people now seem to be taking trips to Russia. A friend of a lady I work for has just come back, and she said it was lovely."
Lockwood spoke bitterly. "The two faces of Russia," he said. "Come to Leningrad and Moscow, see the golden carriage in the Kremlin, the mummy of the great god Lenin and the relics of the Tsar, vodka, caviar, codling. Intourist putting its best foot forward to pull the wool over the eyes of the West, and behind the smiling mask, the cruelest and most treacherous people on earth. They'd never give me a visa, and especially after this book comes out." And he tapped a thick pile of manuscript on his desk. "If I were to contact the girl, they'd have her in one of those cells so fast she wouldn't know what hit her." Mrs. Harris was beginning to see a little. That cell would be somewhere behind that wall.
"Oh,"
she said,
"you're properly in the cart, ain't you?"
which was the strongest expression she knew for a crushing defeat.
"But she'll understand, won't she?"
The full import of Lockwood's tragedy was then revealed. "How can she?" he groaned. "Don't you see? There'd be no report about my expulsion. I'd promised to be in touch with her when I got back to Moscow. That was 6 months ago. What I can't bear, besides everything else, is her thinking I've run out on her." Mrs. Harris drew on her fund of experience.
If she loves you, she'd never think that.
Lockwood cried. What else should she believe? It's classic, isn't it? Madame Butterfly. Mrs. Harris said,
Madam who?
Never mind, said Lockwood. He promised and didn't come back either. It's one of the oldest ploys in the game. Mrs. Harris had no knowledge of the treachery of Lieutenant Pinkerton to poor Chow Chow San, and so she resorted to advice again.
Come on now, love. You're letting this get you down. Use your nut. Write her a letter.
Lockwood shook his head. It won't do, he said. All foreign mail is intercepted and read. At the slightest indication that she had any connection with me, she'd be arrested. They'd see a plot at once. She'd lose her job, if not worse, and she would be subject to endless persecution. The whole picture had now developed for Mrs. Harris, and some of Mr. Lockwood's despair entered her own warm-hearted and sympathetic soul.
Cor blimey, she said. You poor man. You are for the high jump, ain't you?
Never mind me, Lockwood cried. It's her I'm thinking of. Believing I've run out on her like every other sot who's had what he wanted from a girl. It's driving me out of my mind. She's as innocent as a child. Mrs. Harris asked,
What about your pals in the Foreign Office? Didn't you say that...
She only succeeded in rekindling the moment of rage in Lockwood, and he slammed the desk with his fist and shouted, Goddamn bloody hypocrites! Up to yesterday, they said they might do something. That's why I brought out her photo and dared to look at it again. This morning, a flat turn-down. Change in the political situation. Sorry, old boy, can't rock the boat right now, you know. The impasse was quite clear now. If he tried to get through to the girl, she would be implicated. If he didn't, she would go on believing the man she loved had cruelly deserted her, and in the meantime 2 lovers implacably separated were suffering broken hearts. Mrs. Harris, moved to the depth of her being and close to tears, said,
Lord, Mr. Lockwood, I wish I could help you.
Lockwood said gloomily, Nobody can help me. He picked up the photograph and snapped shut the back flap, which assisted it to stand. Mrs. Harris said,
Don't put her away. Leave her there. You never know what might happen. She'll help you keep your tucker up.
He replaced the photo as Mrs. Harris had bidden him, and then for a moment they both fell into silence. And during that silence, Mrs. Harris indulged herself in a fantasy, the kind that often came to her when people were in trouble, or she herself fell prey to an ambition. It was in 2 parts, neither of them connected with anything either sensible or practical. In one, she was facing a group of men behind that fortress wall and giving them a piece of her mind about separating 2 unhappy lovers. In the second, she was ringing the doorbell to Mr. Lockwood's flat, and at her side was Lisabeta something or other, or anyway, as he had called her, Liz. And when he opened the door, Mrs. Harris would cry,
Here she is, Mr. Lockwood. I've been to Russia and brought her back for you.
Lockwood now cleared his throat and said, Well, and made motions of one about to go to work. Mrs. Harris could take a hint and said,
I'll be getting on,
and proceeded to make her preparations to leave for her next rendezvous with dust and dirt and greasy dishes. Chapter 2. Mrs. Harris brooded all the way home that early Saturday evening over Mr. Lockwood's tragic dilemma, and it was still colouring her mood when she foregathered with her bosom friend, Mrs. Violet Butterfield, for their nightly path-crossing cup of tea and gossip. Bosom was an apt word to apply to Mrs. Butterfield, as she was as stout, round, and plump as Mrs. Harris was thin and spare. Only the features in the full-moon face were small, a mouth that formed into a tiny O above a triple row of chins, a button nose, and small, startled eyes. The shape of the mouth was just right for the instant emission of shrieks of fright. For whereas Ada Harris was the complete optimist and the soul of courage, often to the point of recklessness, Mrs. Butterfield was timid, nervous, wholly pessimistic, and given to pronouncements of doom and disaster, particularly when her best friend was taking on one of her notions. At one time, Violet had been a member of that gallant band of women who arose daily at 4 a.m. and sallied forth to clean London's offices before the break of the business day. But lately she had succeeded in acquiring the job of attendant in the ladies' room of the Paradise nightclub in Mayfair. It was this that solidified the nightly ritual, for just as Mrs. Harris was closing down her day's work, so to speak, Violet Butterfield was starting off on hers, enabling them to spend an hour or so together over the teapot and the evening papers. During those sessions, Mrs. Butterfield was able to supply titbits of scandal, gleaned from the chit-chat of ladies who visited her domain, while Mrs. Harris narrated tales of the vagaries of her smarter or more eccentric clients. Oddly, that night, however, she did not feel inclined to pass on the story Mr. Lockwood had told her. The tragic plight of the young lovers seemed to her somehow too sacred to furnish material for tittle-tattle. She preferred to enjoy the sorrow of their plight unshared. Besides which there shortly began a turn of events which temporarily drove it out of her head: the fur coat and the colour television set.
You and your fur coat?
You and your blooming telly!
It was Violet Butterfield who for years had had her eye on a fur coat of musquash, a species of water-rat, which each autumn in the current fashion would appear in the window of Arding and Hobbs, the department store where they did their shopping. It was a losing game, for while Violet scrimped and saved to approach the price of last year's coat, by the time the new season rolled around, the galloping inflation had added another £20 to the price, and whipped it out of reach again. As for Mrs. Harris, her television set was black and white, cantankerous, ancient, and out of date, and given to collapse during crucial moments of favourite programmes. She yearned for the new, modern, giant screen colour set that would turn her basement flat at No. 5 Willis Gardens, Battersea, into a veritable theatre. The price of such a one was over £400, installed, insured, and service guaranteed, as out of reach as her chum's musquash wrapping. Time was when Ada would have tackled the problem. Once she had girded herself to save up the vast sum of £450 to sally across the Channel to buy herself, of all things, a Dior dress. But she was older now, somewhat more easily tired, more fragile. The amassing of such a sum was just not on, and hence neither was the big set. But that did not stop her from wishing. And often on her way home she would pass before a shop displaying such, and look with longing upon the half-dozen machines in the window, all projecting the same scene in gorgeous natural colours. Hot water had been poured into the first dregs of the teapot. Sandwiches had been disposed of. Mrs. Butterfield was already aware that her friend was unusually silent and uncommunicative. She found an item in the evening news that she thought would awaken her interest.
"Hello, hello,"
she said.
"Here's something about a friend of yours."
And she read aloud a date-lined dispatch from Paris, which revealed that the Marquis Hippolyte de Chassagne was ending his tour of duty as Ambassador of France to the United States, and upon his return to Paris would take up an appointment as senior adviser on foreign affairs at the Quai d'Orsay.
"A real pal, wasn't he?"
she added.
"When you was getting elected to Parliament."
Ada examined the paragraph in turn, but made no comment, and Mrs. Butterfield looked at her in surprise, remarking,
Maybe he'd be coming over to London like he used to, and then you could have a visit with him again.
Mrs. Harris.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?